Welcome to the second episode of Peas in a Pod under the segment How Urban Planning Has Become Stagnant and Driving Transformation and Innovation, unpacking the potential of low cost innovation in housing. I go by the name of Mapula Mahale, but you guys can call me Maps. And today we're joined by a special guest that's a former vet student and is an owner of a construction company. He goes by the name of Kabel. Welcome once again to our podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of Peas in the Pod under the segment How Urban Planning Has Become Stagnant and Driving Transformation and Innovation, looking at low cost housing innovations. Today we're joined by a former vet student and also a business owner. He goes by the name of Kabel. Thank you, Kabel, for joining us once again.
Thank you, Mapula.
Oh, okay. So just to start off, can you please just give us a brief about yourself? Tell us about yourself. Tell us about your varsity journey and how you found yourself in construction.
Okay, as already introduced, I'm Kabel, a former vet student. How I found myself in the construction business is really quite simple. In the township where I originally come from, Tembisa, there was a demand for expansion of RTPs. As you know, Tembisa started off as an informal settlement. A lot of people were granted government houses. And with time, with social and financial stratification, they had a desire to extend their houses, whether by one room or two, and also include back rooms to make more or diversify their streams of income. And also through that also came the project of rubble removing and so forth and so on. So it started off from a small demand, and with time, more professional services, more expertise, we went into new market.
That's interesting. So, as you know, construction works hand in hand with your architectures, urban planners, and other careers within the built environment. And with this, it means that when we see the growth of urbanization, it means that there's also a growth in informal settlements, there's a growth in slums around the urban areas. And how do you think that we can create functional informal settlements within our spaces for those who are marginalized?
Functional and what spaces?
So what I mean is what sustainable construction practices can be incorporated into building informal settlements that functions as a home for families.
Oh, so here we are speaking of a plan that can be implemented.
We're speaking about sustainable construction practices that can make building homes or informal settlements, which is like your shacks, more functional and be more like a home for families. How can we make them more functional? Considering that the government has actually been dealing with giving people housing. So it means that in the meantime, something must be done to ensure that these people are residing in like functional homes. So as someone who's in the construction field, how can we make sustainable construction practices that incorporate building that is functional for informal settlements?
Quite frankly, I don't think it's yet possible. Because with time you acquire a skill of accepting things that you can't change and changing the things that you can. You understand? When you speak of informal settlements, you must remember what creates the need for informal settlement.
Yeah.
Right? With more industrialization, it becomes inevitable for informal settlements to develop because industrialists could not care less whether or not their employees, and by employees, I'm speaking of your lay employees, not your senior managers, your executives, and so forth, the groundsmen. the actual people that are operating the means of production, right? One
Yeah.
thing that you must understand, they are low income earners, and they obviously have to be closer to work because of the long working hours, right? And they cannot reside in the city because they don't earn enough salaries to afford them rent in the city, but they also need to be closer to the city. So how best to be closer to the city while also not waiting for the government to fulfill its promise of quality housing, right? Is to establish an informal settlement, which is right next to the city, which is just in the outskirts of the city. So they are, in my perspective, right, much of the urban and urban, regional, and construction field in practicality is filled with a lot of private sector companies, which would not trouble themselves with creating free and quality houses for those masses who are suffering from informal, poor settlements. So, in a nutshell, nothing can be done on the current moment
Okay, but
because
like,
the leadership vacuum in the country in general. The first step would have to be taken by government before we can come on the table, because realistically, Mapula, money is needed to fund those ideas, in which a private sector, no one would be willing to pop out that money.
yeah, that's fully understandable. But like, okay, outside of like funding and like so forth, how would you, if there was someone who was intending on building or establishing the slum in informal settlement, how would you, what materials would you advise them to use to make the home more sustainable and last long and be more resilient to any natural cause that could happen? Like a few weeks ago, we had any earthquake. How do they make sure that their homes are resistant and are functional outside of those outside of those unknown disasters that can take place? How do you make it resilient?
Okay, Mapula, as an urban planner, you must understand that before you can build on land, you must first establish whether or not it's feasible to establish
Yeah, that's
anything. You understand? Exactly.
Yeah.
You must identify what best land use can you utilize the land for. You get it. And despite of any material you might want to use to establish infrastructure, if the land itself or the soil does not permit
Yeah.
that kind of establishment, then it will never resist any natural disaster, because the foundation of where the building is not meant to have a building. Do I make sense?
Yes, you fully make sense. I get that, and I get that most of these slums are built in areas or are put in areas where they're not supposed to be. Some are even put on old mining dumps or wetlands where they're not even supposed to be. That puts them at like a vulnerable space, right? But understanding
Exactly.
understanding the housing issue in South Africa, that's the only way that people can actually survive and be closer to workspaces, right? And it doesn't mean that even if they are built in spaces that uh, are not meant to be built on, they can't at least try to create functional spaces around them. For example, what like for example, in terms of sanitation systems around those spaces, how do people access sanitation? How do they access water? How do they access electricity to survive? And like obviously I get
Mapula, can I interject you there a bit?
yeah,
I think maybe your further elaboration of the topic. You are moving away from the core of what we're discussing here. Remember, me and you two should not be troubling ourselves with how those things happen in the first place. Prevention is always better than a cure, right? So if there was a way to prevent the informal settlements from establishing, we would, because we understand the ripple effects of having an informal settlement.
yeah,
Because establishing a settlement one where the land use does not permit that means that, as also the government does not intend to bring out electricity that far side of the country. One does not intend on bringing municipal systems like your water, your sewage systems, and so forth, which speaks to sanitation.
Yeah.
Right? So it means that everything has to have a plan, and the plan must be implemented because the plan is being reviewed by professionals who are aware of what they are doing and also have studied and have expertise in foresight of some of the natural disasters that might occur, like the previous tremor that we had, right? And to just give light on the topic, a few houses, I think, I don't know where exactly in the country, collapsed. And they collapsed as a direct result of forcing the government into introducing formal services into an informal space that is not allowed or cannot naturally have inhabitants on it. You understand? Yes,
Yeah.
the informal settlement might prevail, but because of natural disasters, one way or another, it will come down crashing. So the government can be forced into introducing sanitation in those informal settlements, introducing roads and electricity. But because the government knows, together with urban planners and other engineers, your hydrologists and so forth, and your electrical engineers will tell you that it's impossible for this to last indefinitely. So at best, it can only be a temporary solution.
That I fully get, yes. That I fully get that it's a temporary solution. That's what I'm saying. Okay, let's not say we, because like you've clearly established that like it's very difficult to build or to seek to implement something on land that is not even supposed to be occupied, right? Considering the factors that could happen with building there. But as if I was someone living in these slums or someone living in these informal settlements, how can I, as someone who's in the construction field, how would you advise me to make my home, to make my space a bit more functional? So like what tools would you recommend for me to use to actually make my home more functional? What building materials would you say, okay, since you're building a slum and you need maybe, what do they call it? You need metal, you need this. So like what would you recommend for people to use to make it a bit more sustainable for the temporary being, I guess?
Quite frankly, I don't think as the construction industry field or the study, we have developed materials that can withstand anything. You get it? And those that can withstand societal and weather pressures are very expensive.
Okay. So would you say it'll be very difficult for
The
people
material to build or make their home more functional in your own way. You understand? Do I make sense?
Yeah, you do make sense.
Yeah, so I'm one person who, through years in this field, I've learned that as much as you might want to promise things that you know are impossible, aspirations must always align with reality. And the reality is, what resources do you have at your disposal? What is the cost of those resources? Do you have the necessary skilled personnel to implement or make the best use of those resources? So, one, we are in an informal settlement, meaning that our buying power is already something that's questionable. You understand? Our foresight is also something that's questionable because the fact that nothing has yet happened there means that we must follow up with what municipal plans. Thing is, I'm speaking of things that I know an ordinary lay person would not be at liberty of knowing, like going to the municipality and asking what are the plans in light of a certain area where they've seen that it's a vacant space and they can occupy near a city. You know, so I think with more years, you learn that there's actually a lot of red tape in the construction company, and not because it's there to restrict access to house infrastructure, but because of the risks that are associated with building infrastructure that's not compliant with and so on. Buildings collapse, people die, you know.
Can you please repeat your last few sentences because I couldn't hear you?
I was saying the unfortunate reality, there's a lot of risks associated with construction.
Okay.
People die, buildings collapse, houses burn because of that absence of someone who's well knowledgeable about the subject matter and can execute a fully functional plan on how something can be established. So the reality is nothing can be done.
So would you say
As said as it is now, to say that, but we can't save informal settlements where the plan itself will never align with what is required.
So then would you say this is the reason why many of informal settlements stay the same throughout and are never really developed because of the red tape that you're talking about? So what would then be the solution for those people residing in those spaces? Would it then be for them to be moved to a better space? Or what would be the solution for them? Because some people have been residing in the same informal settlements for years and they've never seen any sort of development taking place around them. So like, what solutions would you then say should be done or should be put in place to make lives better, their life better?
Okay. As I said, you look at the structure of these informal settlements, how people choose their stands, the way they cut the stands. You understand?
Yeah.
It's just a lot. So it makes it very impossible to come up with or to damage control a situation that repairable. Do I make sense? I'll give the township of Alexandra, for example, right? You look at the way it's so congested there. It even becomes difficult for the municipality to jump up an electricity line because someone has built on top of the electricity line. That makes sense.
Yeah.
The fact that they've been living there for years does not shield the fact that we need to access the electricity line. You get it? For the greater good of the area, Alexandra, we need to access the electricity. But because there's a fact there are considerations, moral and ethical considerations, there's a lot. I personally feel that the best way we can go about assisting people who are already living in an informal area is to start where we know the issue can thoroughly and meaningfully be addressed. One thing we need to recognize, Mapula, is that we have a leadership vacuum in the country, right? The private sector has nothing much they can do with the resources at their disposal and also their levels of jurisdiction. We don't have the authority to go into an open area and start developing low-cost housing. First, we need to acquire the land, right?
Yeah.
And you have to go through processes of justifying what you need the land for, the money required to establish who's gonna pop out that money and provide also the materials that are required to build that infrastructure. No one is willing to come to the table. You understand? Yes, we can talk about RDPs, but look at the rate at which the RDPs are being established. It's taking forever. It's taking forever. You get it? But the rate at which industrialization is happening is not meeting the reality on the other end, which is that people don't have housing.
Yeah.
We want the laborers, as many as they are, we want these young people to come and work these long, strenuous hours, but where are they sleeping? You understand? It's a conversation that no one wants to have. Quite frankly, a lot of industrialists are avoiding, but it's a topic at hand. how do you call someone to further your end, and yet you care little to none about what happens to their social well-being? You understand?
I fully
I think,
understand.
yeah, I think the best people to assist us in reducing informal settlements is these industrialists. When you come up with a grand idea, or when you're an entrepreneur, you want to start an industry or you want to start a factory, the number of personnel that you're going to require to keep your factory functional, you should also establish a settlement for them. You understand? And not an informal one that is quality and is low cost. Do I make sense? In that way, we'll have less and less people trying to establish their own idea of what a home is, and with bad, what do you call it? Bad material.
Yeah. Would you
Exactly.
then?
That's one way we could do it.
Okay, I think it makes sense. Would you then say then it's maybe time that the government actually reaches out to private sector to tackle the issue of homelessness in South Africa, to tackle the issue of informal settlements in South Africa, because it's a growing issue. And post-COVID, we've seen the increase of unemployed people, meaning that more people are actually moving into these slums because they cannot afford the cost of living in South Africa. So if these same people are working for you guys, are working for your private sector, why are you guys not taking care of them? And maybe potentially the solution could be government and private sector working together towards a common goal.
You know what's my approach on this, right? As much as we are a democratic country and a million views are allowed, but at some point the decision must be taken. You understand? And it must be taken by someone with authority who actually has the ability to enforce a decree. So if I were to make a ruling now, I don't have the ability to enforce it because I don't have the police and the military backing my decision. You understand? I don't have enforcement commissions. So if the government was to make it a requirement, like with these compliance certificates that we fill out from year to year, your health certificates, your fire certificates, you understand? If it were to also be incorporated as a requirement here, whenever these other statutory bodies come and check the compliance of companies, that whenever you have an industry, you must also account for where your staff members are living. And the conditions and the environment must be inhabitable. You understand? As long as it's part of a requirement, so when an investor or a multinational corporation comes into South Africa and wants to establish a company, already it comes well knowing that when you hire people, you must account for where they are living, and the living conditions must be inhabitable, and they must be within a set criteria. Maybe to say that per 2 bedrooms, a house must have one bathroom and one toilet, a lounge, and a kitchen. You understand? If we make it a standard, and now in the beginning of the, it's gonna be a problem. It's gonna receive a lot of backlash, but with time, it's gonna become a culture. Remember that sort of over a period of time. So if we start now, by the next 5 to 10 years, believe me, we might have not, at least will be at 30 to 40% now.
Can you please just repeat yourself?
What?
Can you please just repeat your last sentence? I don't know if it's your Wi-Fi or it's mine, but can you just please repeat the last sentence?
I was saying that it's gonna take us time to get this right, but if we start now, in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll at least have 40% of people who are currently in the informal settlements inhabiting better and low-cost housing. One that is actually inhabitable and that is built on areas that infrastructure can actually be built. Areas that have been assessed by geologists and also urban planners and have identified and zoned the area as residential, not one that is forced by the need for housing.
Yeah, that's true. Do you think then, would you say then, post 1994, the goals that were said or were told to the people about the realization of proper housing was never realized then? Would you say that the government did try? Yes, there was a policy, yes, and I would agree that South Africa has probably the most progressive policies ever, but implementation was not so progressive, and it has put us in the situation where as the young generation is forced to now tackle and come up with new strategies of making sure that we make it out of this so-called struggle of housing that people are facing within South Africa, because obviously it plays a certain role on the economics of South Africa. It plays a certain role on development of South Africa and where South Africa actually stands as a country. And when that happens, it means that it affects all of us. So would you say then that the goals that were said were never fully established, and now it's up to us and innovation to make it better?
I think the goals were a bit unrealistic.
In what way?
The goals that were set, the RDP project, right?
Yeah.
For me, it was at the time. You know, when you set the strategic plan, you set the time frame, and you set the resources required to implement the plan, and the personnel required, and the personnel responsible for implementing the plan, and the periods or the frequencies of review.
Yeah.
Right? That is a fully functional plan. Now, at the time, we must look at when we started the administration of a new and democratic South Africa in 1994. We must understand that at the time, we had a liberation movement in governance.
Yeah.
Right? It's a movement, not a party. Do I get it? This makes a huge distinction, because after the fighting, there was no plan as to from here what happened. It was tackled day to day. As we woke up, we tackled whatever we needed to get tackled to survive. Do I make sense? Yeah, because at the time, in 1994, you look at most of what was said, most of the promises that were made, some of the policies that were implemented. I don't think they spoke to the South Africa at the time. Neither did it speak to the ever-rising demand that would accrue over time. And okay, if there's a plan, I want RDPs a year. Who is responsible for this? What is required? Do we have the budget? Yes. Is the Minister of Rural Development and Housing the right person to implement this? Are they a person who had experience in this field? Have they done this before? You get it?
Yeah.
Instead, in 1994, we appointed cadres. Cadre deployment, people who've served the African National Congress for years, people who've been loyal, people who've been to jail. I don't remember that ever being a requirement for any job in South Africa. But here it was in our government. We gave people positions out of loyalty. We deployed a significant and substantial number of them in governance. Hence, there was a delay in the starting phase of the RDP project. Right? Because if you remember from 1994, when the first few RDPs were built, I can tell you it was only up until the early 2000s. And you look at the number of RDPs that were built, it was not even a lot, just, to keep those few voting cows of the ANC quiet, Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Exactly. I guess then our biggest issue is poor governance then. That exactly. after the strike, I think this is a big conversation that we need to be realistic and open about as South Africans, that maybe poor governance was the root of all our problems, because we deploy people that actually were never taught on how governance is supposed to take place, and were never actually in governance, and they don't even know what it means to be in governance, because the only form of leadership that they've only experienced is through ground forcing when they're fighting,
exactly.
when they're fighting for democracy. And maybe that's the biggest issue. And as South Africans, we're too happy for this so-called freedom that we didn't realize the implications of what poor governance would do to the country as well. So actually, you're right. It makes sense. It really makes sense that the biggest foundation of our problems in South Africa are poor governance, and maybe with the next generation, we're able to see and tackle leadership in a different way and understand that leadership doesn't only revolve around politics, but it revolves around the spaces that you belong in.
I think our biggest thing is the criteria that we use to appoint people, right? In my years in the private sector and also in the corporate space, I have never seen knowing how to protest being a requirement to occupy any portfolio, right? I've never seen going to jail being a requirement for any portfolio. I've never seen being in exile for a number of years being a requirement for any portfolio. Neither has it been in other countries that are Western countries, right? The only reason why Western countries are thriving is because they don't make a mistake when it comes to their leadership. Their electoral processes and systems, you would get to understand that when you get into governance, you are not there because you are riding the same horses, Tom, Dick, and Harry. You are in governance because a certain portion of the country elected you individually as a leader. You understand? Not because you are part of a larger conglomerate that is running the country. Do you get it? And I think much of the biggest issue is that we don't have accountability platforms, or we don't have, as the voters, we are not at liberty to decide whether or not we can pass a vote of no confidence against the president and he can be withdrawn for his actions. We don't have a platform or a system as a country where we can air our dissatisfaction and actually act on our dissatisfaction. Do I make sense? It's like in employment, given a warning. There's nothing like that for any political portfolio in the country.
Yeah,
exactly. It's up to them to decide how they deal with one another. It's as if we are there to get them from point A to B, but what happens from point B to Z, we are not involved. We will only have a say again in the next 5 years. And I think we have realized over the years that 5 years is a long time to cripple a country.
That is true. So as we're heading towards the end of our interview, what direction would you like to see innovation take in South Africa in maybe like human settlement? Considering that you're in the construction business, what types of innovation are you looking forward to, and what innovation do you think should come up from Africans even?
Okay. The first point of departure should be that we must first look at where we are as a country, what do we need in order to break even, and say that although we are not where we're trying to be, but we are at a better place than we were yesterday. All right?
Yeah.
The biggest innovation and invention I would like to see come out from the field of construction engineering, build or come up with materials that can be placed in wetlands and still resist any form of a natural disaster.
Yeah.
You understand? I think we're not cracking our heads enough. We're not thinking out of the box enough. Every material that we're currently using to build has been there. There's nothing new that we're introduced. Yes. It exists because previously or traditionally, this is what people needed. We need something new. Something that is going to be, or make, in your own words, informal settlements currently more functional. The
Yeah.
truth is we don't have those kinds of materials to make it more functional. Instead, we would all obviously opt that those buildings or infrastructure be demolished and we start from scratch in a better area. But why can't we make it in that area? Meaning that we're not thinking enough, we're not applying ourselves enough. So the best innovation for me right now is to tackle the issue head on. We are on informal settlements. What then do? How do we make it work? And make it more functional, and also ensure that whatever plan that we're coming up with is a lifetime plan, not one that is only going to buy us time.
That's interesting, actually. That's
exactly.
something.
That's the innovation, yeah.
Yeah, that's something for people to think about after listening to this episode. What new innovations are we thinking about as Africans to actually tackle informal settlements and create a better living condition for them? And I'd just like to say thank you once again for agreeing to be on my podcast. I really appreciate it. You feel free to say anything before we close off. That's all I have to say. So thank you for being on my podcast and thank you for your time. And to the listeners, please tune in to the third episode that we'll be taking up next.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mapula Mahali. It's been a pleasure sharing my insight and knowledge on the current burning topic on what new innovative ways can urban and regional planning come up with to curb the ever-rising need for informal settlement. Thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
To all the listeners and the new YouTubers and the new subscribers, please continue subscribing to our YouTube channel. And once again, thank you to my lecturer and my classmates. Tune in onto the third episode. Bye.